The idea of a woman becoming pope dressed as a man has fascinated people for a long time. It sounds like something from a novel, but many have asked if this really happened. Did a female pope, known as Pope Joan, truly sit on the chair of St. Peter during the Middle Ages? The simple answer, backed by most historians, is no. There was no real female pope. The story is a legend, but it is a very old and powerful legend. It tells us a lot about the times it came from. It shows how stories can grow and change. It also shows how people think about power, gender, and faith. We can explore this legend, its origins, and why it became so popular. We will see why it holds a place in history, even if it is not a true one. The tale of Pope Joan first appeared in writing many centuries after she supposedly lived. This is a key point. If such an amazing thing happened, you would expect people to write about it at the time. But they did not. The legend says a very smart woman, disguised as a man, rose through the church. She became a cardinal, then she became pope. She ruled for over 2 years. Her true identity was only found out when she gave birth during a procession. This was a shocking and public event. The legend says she died soon after. Her story became a warning for some. For others, it was proof of papal corruption. But for historians today, it is a myth. It is a very persistent one. It needs a closer look to understand why it was believed. The story of Pope Joan is one of the most famous legends of the Middle Ages. It is a tale of disguise, ambition, and a secret life. The core of the legend is simple. A woman, highly intelligent and educated, wished to pursue studies that were not open to women. So, she disguised herself as a man. She took on a male name. She then rose through the ranks of the church. Her brilliance was so great that she became a cardinal. Eventually, she was elected pope. She reigned as Pope John, or sometimes other names like Pope Agnes or Clement. Her papacy supposedly lasted for a little over 2 years. Her secret was kept until a critical moment. The legend says she became pregnant by one of her companions. During a papal procession through the streets of Rome, she went into labor. She gave birth to a child in public, right there on the street. This shocking event revealed her true identity. She supposedly died on the spot, or shortly after. The spot where this happened was then avoided by future papal processions. A special chair with a hole in the seat was supposedly used in later papal elections to check the sex of the new pope. This was to prevent another woman from becoming pope. The legend first clearly appeared in written form in the 13th century. This is about 400 years after she supposedly lived. One of the earliest mentions comes from a chronicle by Jean de Mailly. He wrote it around 1250. His account is brief. It places her papacy around the year 1099. He says a certain Pope John was a woman. She was found out when she gave birth. She was buried where she died. The full story, the one most people know, comes from another chronicler. This was Martin of Opava, also known as Martinus Polonus. He wrote his widely read Chronicon Pontificum et Imperatorum, Chronicle of Popes and Emperors, around 1260. Martin of Opava's version is much more detailed. He names her John Anglicus. He places her papacy between Leo IV and Benedict III. This would be around the year 855. His account describes her birth in Mainz, Germany. Her love for learning led her to Athens with a male lover. She returned to Rome disguised. She became a notary, then a cardinal. Finally, she became pope. She governed well. Then came the public birth and her death. Martin's chronicle became incredibly popular. It was copied many times. It was translated into many languages. It became the standard version of the story. This is how the legend spread across Europe. It became a widely accepted fact for many centuries. But the key here is the timeline. The first clear written accounts appeared in the 13th century. This is a very long gap between the supposed event and its telling. This alone raises red flags for historians. If a woman had been pope, it would have been a scandal of immense proportions. It would have been documented by many people at the time. Yet, there is silence from the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. No letters, no official documents, no other chronicles from the supposed time of her reign mention her. This lack of contemporary evidence is the biggest problem for the legend, but the story was a good one. It fits certain ideas people had about the church, so it took hold and grew. To understand the legend, we need to look closer at its first appearances in writing. As mentioned, the first clear accounts are from the 13th century, but there is a bit of confusion around an earlier source. Some point to Marianus Scotus. He was a monk from the 11th century. His chronicle, Chronicon Universala, has a small entry about a Pope John. This entry states, Leo IV reigned for 5 years, 2 months, 5 days. Then a woman, John, reigned for 2 years, 5 months, 4 days. Then Benedict III reigned for 2 years, 6 months, 10 days. This entry seems to place Joan between two known popes. This would be in the mid-9th century. However, there is a big problem with Mariana Scotus's chronicle. Most scholars agree that this entry about a female pope was not in his original work. It was added later by other scribes. This was likely done in the 13th century. These scribes probably added it after hearing the story from other sources. So, Mariana Scotus's chronicle is not truly an 11th century source for Pope Joan. It is a later interpolation. This means the 13th century remains the true starting point for written accounts. The two main 13th century sources are Jean de Mailly and Martin of Opava. Jean de Mailly was a Dominican friar. He included the story in his Chronica Universalis Matensis. He placed the event around 1099, not the 9th century. His account is brief and almost an aside. It just states that a Pope John was found to be a woman. She gave birth in Rome. She died. The details are sparse. This suggests the story was already circulating. He was just recording it. But it was Martin of Opava who gave the legend its power and its specific details. He was a chaplain to popes and an important chronicler. His Chronicon Pontificum et Imperatorum was a hugely influential work. And it became a standard history text across Europe. Martin's version is much more elaborate. He names her John Anglicus. He states she was born in Mainz. He gives her precise reign dates 2 years, 7 months, 4 days. He says she was learned in Athens, she taught in Rome, she was elected pope by general consent. He also adds the detail about the public birth and her immediate death. He says she was buried without honor. He even states the exact street where it happened, between the Colosseum and St. Clement's Church. Martin of Opava's account includes specific details that made the story feel very real. The names, dates, and locations. This gave it a weight that Jean de Mailly's brief mention did not. Because Martin's chronicle was so widely copied, the story of Pope Joan became part of the accepted history. It was read by scholars, monks, and educated people for centuries. It was not just a fleeting rumor. It became a fact in many historical records. The timing of these accounts is crucial. Why did such a tale emerge in the 13th century? This was a time of great change. It was a time of questioning and critique of the church. It was also a time when the power of the Pope was very high. A story like Pope Joan could be a way to express concerns. It could be a way to criticize perceived weaknesses or corruption within the church. The gap of 400 years is too big to ignore. If she had been a real pope, the church itself would have had to deal with the fallout. They would have written about it. But there is no trace of such a crisis in any contemporary record. The spark of the story was not a real event. It was a later invention. It tapped into the anxieties and narratives of the 13th century, not the 9th. Once Martin of Opava put the story of Pope Joan into his influential chronicle, it did not just sit there. It exploded. It became a central part of many historical narratives for centuries. The story grew. It gathered more details and implications. It became a lens through which people viewed the papacy. One of the biggest reasons for its spread was the invention of the printing press in the 15th century. Before printing, books were copied by hand. This was slow and expensive. But with the printing press, books like Martin of Opava's Chronicle could be mass-produced. They reached a much wider audience. This solidified the legend's place in popular imagination. Many early printed editions of Martin's work included the story of Pope Joan. It was often presented as historical fact. The story was not just in chronicles. It started to appear in other places too. For example, a bust of Pope Joan was once part of a series of papal busts in Siena Cathedral. This was sculpted by Giovanni di Maestro Stefano. It showed a female pope named Jan VIII. It was there for about 2 centuries. This shows how deeply the story was believed, even in official church settings. The bust was later altered. It was changed into a male pope, Pope Zachary, around 1600. This was probably due to the Counter-Reformation. The Catholic Church tried to suppress such stories during that period. The legend also led to popular beliefs and practices. One famous example is the Sella Stercoraria. This was a special chair made of porphyry with a hole in the seat. The legend says this chair was used after Pope Joan to check the sex of new popes. And they would sit on it, and a cardinal would feel under the seat. He would then announce, "Duos habet et bene pendentes." He has 2 and they hang well. This was supposed to confirm the pope was a man. It sounds outlandish, but the chairs themselves did exist. They were used in papal coronations. However, their purpose was likely symbolic. They represented the humility of the new pope, sitting on a lowly stool before ascending to the papal throne. Or they may have been ancient Roman birthing stools were used. The legend provided a dramatic explanation for their existence. Another detail that grew around the legend was the papal procession route. It was believed that popes deliberately avoided a certain street in Rome during their processions. This was supposedly the street where Pope Joan gave birth. They did this to avoid remembering her scandal. While popes did take various routes, there is no historical evidence that any specific route was avoided because of Pope Joan. The legend simply supplied a reason for existing practices. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century gave Pope Joan's story an even bigger boost. Protestant reformers like John Huss and Martin Luther used the legend as anti-Catholic propaganda. They saw it as proof of the corruption and moral decay of the papacy. It showed that the Catholic Church was fallible. It showed that it was not truly guided by God. They pointed to Pope Joan as evidence that Rome could err. This made the story even more widely known and believed. It was spread through pamphlets and sermons. It was a powerful tool in their arguments against the Roman Catholic Church. The Renaissance also took interest. Giovanni Boccaccio included her story in his De Mulieribus Claris on famous women. He presented it as a tale of remarkable women. This acceptance by different groups for different reasons cemented Pope Joan's place in history. It became a legend that was too useful and too compelling to simply disappear. It shaped how people thought about the church, even if the core story was not true. The story of Pope Joan had grown far beyond its initial telling. It had become woven into the fabric of European culture and history. Despite its widespread acceptance for centuries, modern historians almost universally agree that Pope Joan was a myth. The main reason is simple: there is no credible contemporary evidence for her existence. This is the biggest nail in the coffin of the legend. Let's look at the historical record from the 9th century, when she supposedly reigned. This period is well documented. We have papal lists, we have letters, we have official church records. We have chronicles from people who lived at the time. None of these primary sources mention a female pope. There is a continuous, unbroken line of male popes during that period. The legend places Pope Joan between Leo IV, 847 to 855, and Benedict III, 855 to 858. Historical records for these two popes are clear. Leo IV died on July 17, 855. Benedict III was elected shortly after. There was a brief delay in his consecration. This was due to a dispute with an anti-pope, Anastasius Bibliotarius. But Benedict III was consecrated on September 29, 855. This means there is no gap in the papal succession for Pope Joan to fit into. The dates just do not work. There is no 2-year, 5-month, or 7-month period for her reign. The historical record for the 9th century is too solid to allow for such an event to go unnoticed. Furthermore, we have many documents from Pope Benedict III's early reign. There are letters he sent. There are records of his actions. These show him taking office immediately after Leo IV's death. There is no hint of an interim female pope. This silence is deafening. If a woman had been pope, it would have been a massive scandal. It would have triggered an unprecedented crisis. Every document, every record, every contemporary chronicler would have written about it. But they did not. The later chronicles, like Martin of Opava's, are simply not reliable sources for events 400 years in the past. These chroniclers often copied from each other. They often included folklore and legends alongside genuine historical facts. Their works are valuable for understanding what people believed in the 13th century. But they are not primary evidence for the 9th century. Historians use primary sources. These are documents created at the time of the event. Martin of Opava's chronicle is a secondary source for the 9th century. And it is a very late one. What about the physical proofs that grew around the story? The sella statuaria, the birthing stool perforated chair, definitely existed. But its purpose was likely symbolic, or was a reused ancient Roman item. It was not for checking the Pope's sex. The legend simply attached itself to an existing object. It gave it a dramatic backstory. There is no evidence of such a ritual ever being formally adopted by the Church. The changing of the bust in Siena Cathedral is also not proof. Its original presence shows how widely believed the legend was. But its later alteration shows that the Church, when faced with scrutiny, decided to remove the evidence. This does not confirm the story was true and then hidden. It confirms that it was a story that eventually caused embarrassment. The supposed avoidance of a street in Rome by papal processions also has no historical basis. Papal processions changed routes for many reasons. These included practical considerations, political reasons, or changes in the city's layout. There is no actual evidence linking a specific route avoidance to Pope Joan. This too is a later embellishment of the legend. In short, when historians examine the evidence, the legend of Pope Joan falls apart. There is a complete absence of contemporary evidence. The timelines of known popes are continuous. The proofs are either misinterpretations of existing objects or later additions to the story. The consensus is clear. Pope Joan was a powerful, enduring myth, but not a historical reality. She did not sit on the papal throne, so if Pope Joan was not real, why did this powerful legend emerge? And why did it persist for centuries, capturing the imagination of so many people? The story of Pope Joan tells us more about the times and the people who told it than it does about papal history itself. One possible origin for the legend is as a satirical tale. The Middle Ages had a strong tradition of satire. This included stories that poked fun at authority figures. A story of a woman disguised as a pope, who then gives birth, is a hugely subversive and scandalous idea. It would have been a powerful critique of the papacy. It might have been a way to comment on perceived corruption or weakness within the church. Perhaps it was a dig at a pope who was seen as weak or effeminate. Some scholars suggest the story was originally about a specific pope who was then satirically called Pope Joan because he was seen as too soft or controlled by women. Another theory connects the legend to misogyny, or the dislike of women. In medieval society, women were generally seen as inferior to men. They were thought to be less rational and more emotional. The idea of a woman in the highest position of power, particularly in the church, would have been deeply unsettling for many. The legend could serve as a cautionary tale. It showed the supposed dangers of allowing women into power. In her public, scandalous unmasking and death could be seen as divine punishment for breaking gender norms. It would reinforce the idea that a woman's place was not in such a position. The legend might also have emerged to explain existing customs or anomalies. As we discussed, the Sella Stercoraria chairs existed. People might have wondered about their strange shape. The story of Pope Joan provided a dramatic and memorable explanation. This is a common way folklore develops. People create stories to make sense of things they do not fully understand. The Dark Ages period itself might have played a role. While the 9th century was not entirely dark, records could be less complete than other periods. This could have created a fertile ground for such stories to take root. Gaps in knowledge can be filled by imaginative tales. The legend's persistence is perhaps even more interesting than its origin. One major reason was its usefulness during the Protestant Reformation. For reformers, Pope Joan was a godsend. She was undeniable proof in their eyes of the papacy's deep flaws. She demonstrated that the Pope was not infallible. She showed that the institution could be deceived and corrupted. This made the story too powerful a weapon to let go of. It was actively promoted and spread by Protestants for centuries. It became a key part of their anti-Catholic polemic. But it was not just Protestants who kept the story alive. The legend has an inherent dramatic power. It is a story of a brilliant underdog. It is a story of a woman defying expectations. It is a secret life, a public fall. These elements make for a compelling narrative. It appeals to a sense of justice or to a desire for the powerful to be exposed as flawed. It challenges authority. People love a good story, and Pope Joan's tale is certainly that. Even in modern times, the legend continues to fascinate. It touches on enduring themes. These include gender roles, power, secrets, and the human desire to rise above one's station. It allows for discussions about women's place in society and in the church. It reminds us that history is not just a dry list of facts. It is also shaped by stories, beliefs, and myths. In conclusion, when we ask if there was a real female pope in the Middle Ages, the answer from history is a firm no. There is no evidence for Pope Joan. The historical record for the 9th century is too consistent. The story is a legend that emerged centuries later, but this legend is significant. It tells us about medieval attitudes, it tells us about religious conflict, it tells us about the power of storytelling. Pope Joan may not have been a real person, but her story has had a very real impact on how people have understood the papacy and the role of women throughout history.